I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe, sound, and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions, at least for now, on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. This morning, I'm truly pleased and very happy to welcome Clarissa Ward to Carnegie. Clarissa is CNN's senior international correspondent, an accomplished and award-winning journalist, and it's wonderful to have you on the program. Clarissa, welcome to Carnegie Connects.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be with you.
You know, I'd like to start, if you wouldn't mind, with sort of unpacking the Clarissa Ward backstory. I interviewed Madeline Albright, and we lost her last week. Extraordinary human. Truly, I had the honor and privilege of working for her. And when I interviewed her, I reminded her of the story that she had told about passing through Heathrow Airport when one of the British customs officials questioned her, one of her travel documents. She was late for the meeting and obviously frustrated, and said, "Do you know who I am?" And the Brit replied, as only the Brits could, "No, but we have a lot of good doctors who could help you figure that out." So I'd like to start by asking you, not the existential question, who is Clarissa, what kind of experiences and sensibilities shaped your life and your decision, not just to become a journalist, but to become a journalist in conflict areas during war and dislocation?
So I think, I had a sort of slightly peripatetic upbringing. My mother is American. My father is British. I was born in London. We moved to New York when I was 2. I moved back to the UK when I was 8. My parents were both workaholics. And so I had a lot of time on my own. I'm an only child. And I was sent to boarding school when I was 10 years old. And it was one of these really sort of old school, dismal, stuffy, incredibly strict, horrible boarding schools, which is not, not something that anyone needs to pity or anything like that. But what I would say is, because of that, and because of growing up between the US and the UK, and my accent used to change back and forth. And then my father moved to Hong Kong when I was 14 years old. And so we would spend a lot of time in Asia. I always had a sense, I guess, of not really belonging anywhere, but being able to fit in anywhere. And in some strange way, I do think that is the sort of making of a foreign correspondent. You have to be able to put down roots anywhere, but you don't necessarily belong to any one place. And, I've always been something of a chameleon in that sense. And in terms of what drew me to conflict reporting particularly, it really was 9/11. I was in my senior year at Yale. I was studying comparative literature. I thought I wanted to be an actress at the time. And then as I watched this tragedy unfold on television, I understood implicitly that, first of all, I had been very disengaged with what was going on in the world. And I felt a little bit ashamed of that. And I felt a strong calling. And, keep in mind, I was 22, so there was a lot of hubris at work here. But to try to act as a translator between worlds, and to try to travel to the tip of the spear, as it were, and understand better how this had happened and why this had happened and what motivated it and where the breakdown in communication was. And I think that although, my career has changed a lot over time, somehow that is still the fundamental motivation. It's about connecting people, making the abstract feel real, making the other feel intimate.
And that would require not just being a journalist, but being a journalist in the field.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways, especially nowadays with so much on social media and, people building up these huge followings on Twitter, and really they are, it's a different kind of journalism. It tends to be a little bit more opinionated, and maybe more analytical. for me, the excitement of this job personally has always been to be in the field and to be kind of pushing the boundaries of what I know and what is familiar and what is safe, not in any sort of gratuitous sense, like an adrenaline junkie, but really to try to foster a deeper understanding of forces that have traditionally been seen as unreachable or dismissed as evil or whatever it may be. And also, even more importantly, to try to give a voice to people living in these places who are far too often marginalized and who don't get to have their say on the record. So there's many different kinds of journalism. I have a tremendous amount of respect for all of them, but I'm only any good at one of them.
Right. To paraphrase Hobbes, for so many in the regions that you cover, life in conflict is nasty, brutish, and short. And I wonder, how do you keep a sense of detachment when you're surrounded by so much despair, so much violence? I mean, you've covered Syria, you covered Myanmar, you covered Afghanistan, Iraq, you spent time in Gaza. How do you maintain a sense of detachment? How does Clarissa Ward not become literally part of the story that she's covering?
So first of all, I would say that I haven't always been successful in that. I think you mentioned Syria, like definitely with that conflict. It went on for so long and I was invested so deeply and the risks were so huge and the losses were so great. And I really, like a lot of people I knew and was friends with, were killed or captured or kidnapped or arrested and tortured. And, that will take a toll on you. And you will feel personally involved at a certain point. But you learn from that experience. In general, I would say that when you're in the field, you have to be able to compartmentalize. And that's what separates people who can do this job from people who are more suited to other jobs. Because much like a trauma surgeon in an ER, and although we're not saving lives, when you're in the field and you're in danger and there's a huge amount of stress and a huge amount at stake, and you have a lot of work to do as well, you have to be able to kind of put your emotions to the side and really forge ahead and get the job done. That doesn't mean that you don't stop to talk to people, to listen to people, to bear witness. It doesn't mean you're not present in that moment, but it means that there are certain emotions that you will just compartmentalize with the understanding, I would hope for most of us, that when you go home, you'll do some work and take some time to try to unpack that, because it's not healthy just to absorb it and never process it. But in the moment, in the field, you have to be a little bit disciplined about curtailing or controlling those emotions, whether it's fear, whether it's sadness, whether it's missing your family. You really have to be a little strict with yourself to stop yourself from going there, because once you go there, it's tough to come back.
There is that one clip that circulated when you were in Ukraine. I think it was John Berman who was hosting the broadcast. You actually interrupted him. I think you said, "Excuse me, I've got to assist." And I think this was in Irpin,
I
believe, a suburb of Kyiv, which the Ukrainian military has recently regained control over, apparently, as the Russians have withdrawn, at least for now. And you were helping this woman ascend a rather steep, I think, rather steep hill. And you actually interrupted the broadcast to help her. Now, that's not the same thing as intervening when you were in China, when a Uyghur was being beaten by Chinese security officials, and you felt the need to intervene, knowing you couldn't.
Yeah.
But that line is a hard one to maintain. Even if you don't intervene, psychologically, you have to identify with the people you're covering, and that's very difficult in conflicts in which there's not a black and a white.
Yeah. I mean, there's very rarely black and white in any conflict, although I'd say Ukraine is as close as it gets of all the conflicts I've covered. But No, I would say that it is a tough line, right? But the more I do this work, the more convinced I become that like you can be a human being and be a reporter, and you can be empathetic and be a reporter, and you can pause a live shot for literally 30 seconds to help an old lady who asked for help. By the way, it wasn't that I just, she kind of was like moaning and asking for help, and she had 2 bags. And so I carried her bag and I sort of kept talking and directed her on her way. And I really didn't think anything of it. And it was kind of surprising to me when it went viral and lots of people were talking about it, because frankly, it's something that all of us would do in any situation. Like you see an old person trying to cross the road and they look a bit confused, you're going to offer your arm and walk them across the road. But you're right. I think it struck a chord with people because we're used to reporters traditionally as having this kind of detached, the voice of God. And this was a moment where you kind of cut through that. And you're also just being a human being and having an authentic moment. And I think that there are boundaries to that, absolutely, that you have to respect. But I also think that occasionally those kinds of moments really punch through, because they remind people that this isn't just some abstraction that they're hearing about on the news with this network track voice telling you about what's happening in Ukraine. Like, this is real.
Yeah.
This is real. And we live in a world now where the nature of social media and mass communication has really changed the way we tell stories. It's changed the way we do reportage. And I do think there's more space now, and I actually think it's a good thing, to be a little more intimate and personal with the way you tell stories. Obviously, there are certain lines that you can't cross. And if I saw again that poor Uyghur man being beaten by Chinese security forces, as I saw back in 2009, I still would not stand in to intervene. Like that would be the wrong thing to do as a journalist. My job is to record that moment. But I felt I could get away with helping the lady with her bags.
How do you handle fear? I think you once described it as potentially crippling, and it is. And you never know how a human is going to react under stress when actually posed with serious risk.
Yeah.
How do you handle fear?
So first of all, I think you get better at handling it as you become more experienced. And everyone has a different threshold. But I would say, like, if you don't feel fear in these situations, you're stupid and you shouldn't be there, because they are very dangerous situations. And fear is a very healthy human reaction to try to guide you in terms of how you deal with that situation. Now, what you can't do, though, is succumb to fear, because fear and panic are kind of bedfellows. And those are the two things. Well, panic especially can get you into real trouble in a war zone. And also, fear can also lead your imagination to run wild. And so something will become 10 times more ominous or frightening a prospect than it actually is, simply because you've allowed yourself to get kind of carried away with the idea of it. So what you learn to do is not to erase the fear, because the fear is there for a reason and it needs to be there. But you learn to harness it and control it and make sure that it does not overtake the rational mind. So the rational mind is still what needs to be in control in terms of how we make these decisions, the conversations we have, the plans we draw up, the steps we take along the way to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in danger. And then, yes, okay, hello, fear. Hello, old friend. I feel you there. And you're there to remind me that I need to be alert and vigilant. But I can't suddenly start panicking that, a mortar is going to land next to me, because A, I have no way of being able to channel that into something productive and helpful. And B, it's going to prevent me from doing my work. And so when I'm doing my work, I really try to get very calm and not erase the fear, but know when to listen to it versus listening to what's going on in your brain.
If fear is one thing, and clearly you can't anticipate an untoward event like an incoming mortar. Risk is another thing, and you've got to calibrate and calculate when you are going to risk. there's a story, I think either you told it in one of the interviews, about your reporting in Syria, that you entered the country posing as a tourist.
Mm.
You were shooting your own videos on memory cards. And I think in the end, if I have this right, you had to smuggle them out of the country, stitching them into your underwear, into your clothing.
Yeah.
Now, that's the definition of intrepid. But how do you make judgments about when to actually cross the line in terms of jeopardizing your own well-being?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, no, I wrote about that in my book. And the reason I had to go alone in the end was because I got the visa, a tourism visa, but the producer I was supposed to go in with did not get the visa. So the decision was, do I just lose the visa and not go, or do I try to go alone? And I knew all along I was going to go alone.
Right.
I also felt pretty comfortable with the risk because I knew that my worst case scenario at that stage was probably that I would get arrested, and maybe beaten up a bit and then expelled from the country. I wasn't worried about being killed by Syrian security forces at that stage. This is in the very beginning of the uprising. I was also very concerned, though, about the Syrian activists who I was staying with. So I made sure that I never got any of their faces in the video, even though some of them said they wanted to be shown on camera. I never put any of them on camera. And, it may have been excessively cautious to sew those memory cards into my underpants, but, I was going to be stopped at a checkpoint when I was leaving the country. I had this whole ruse going that I was a tourist and I was a decorator, and I had bought some tchotchkes to try to back up my story, but it wasn't probably super convincing because, let's face it, there were not very many tourists or decorators going to Syria 6 months into the uprising. So I think what it shows, though, is when you are going to take risk, you have got to plan. And it's very easy to sort of get an idea, get excited about it, and just go charging after it. And that's why at CNN and a lot of the other networks I've worked at, you work with these security consultants. They come with you in the field, but before you can go out, you have to write a risk assessment. And and it's painful when you're doing it in the moment. And you're like, this is the hospital in this place. This is the hospital in that place. This is what we're going to do here. This is the license plate number of the car. This is and you feel sometimes it's tedious, it's a drag, it's excessive. No, it's not. It's hugely important because it's basically forcing you every time you go out the door to methodically, step by step. And everyone understands that best laid plans, right? And that things might not go as you anticipate, but you have to have those preparations in place so that if, God forbid, something does happen, it really isn't going to be so hard for people to find you or to know exactly where to look for you or what the best way to go about dealing with the situation is. And you have check-ins scheduled and code words and all sorts of things that sometimes can feel a little bit sort of laborious, but are truly essential in terms of making sure that you're in the right mindset to do something risky.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about gender. You represent a long line of female journalists who have done extraordinary work. Frances Fitzgerald won a Pulitzer for her report in Vietnam. Martha Gellhorn, I think I mentioned to you in the break that she had smuggled herself on a hospital ship during World War II in order to cover D-Day. So, and of course, our mutual friend and colleague, Christiana Lampour. How has gender influenced your work? How much of a constraint or an obstacle has it been?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that. I mean, and I get this question a lot, and I would actually say rather the reverse. For me, it's been an asset. And I mean, first of all, I would just say that we all are sort of operating in the field as women, and there's many of us doing it now on the back of the works of people like Gellhorn and Christian and so many others who were the trailblazers. Nowadays, there are many more women doing this. And I think that a lot of us have understood that there are actually distinct advantages. For example, I work a lot in the Middle East. Obviously, you have spent much of your career looking at the Middle East, and you know that at some very conservative parts, men are not allowed into female areas of the house. And so what you have had in some of these places is that 50% of the population have not really had their voices told traditionally in our accounts of war because men don't have access to them. Now, what's interesting is that as a Western woman, I still occupy this rarefied space where I am allowed access to the men's area. So I'm, in Afghanistan, they used to joke that we were honorary men, but still could move between the two sides. So I view that as being a distinct advantage. I also like to joke with people that sometimes it's a real asset to be underestimated, because there is a sense often doing this work as a woman that people don't expect you to challenge them as much. They don't expect you to be as critical. They don't see you as much of a threat. I can sort of, sometimes play dumb or sit in the back of a car and pretend to be asleep and get through a checkpoint. And so for me, I found there's like a number of occasions and instances where being a woman has actually been something that's worked in my favor. There are obviously occasions where it does not. I mean, there's a huge amount of misogyny all around the world, and in America too.
And back here, right in Washington, D.C.
Exactly. So, but at the same time, my attitude to that has always been, you can't let that slow you down or worry you. You just got to be creative about how you get around it, how you make it work to your advantage, and get over it a little bit.
I watched I watched Madeline Albright again. She's much on my mind these days. Operate for 4 years in the Middle East, and it took me about 10 seconds to understand, not only from her perspective, but from the perspective of the in this case the Arabs and the Israelis that she dealt with, that they were dealing with the 64th Secretary of State of the United States of America. Period. Mm-hmm. And if in fact Arabs and Israelis took advantage of America during those years, it was not because of Madeline Albright's gender. It was because of the policies that we were pursuing. But I think that's so. It's interesting that you see gender as a positive rather than as a negative aspect of your work.
Yeah. And I just think that that's probably my nature in general, right? Like, you are what you've got and you work with it and you make it work to your advantage. And again, like I keep coming back to the sort of the crux of it for me is about giving women a voice, giving mothers a voice, having those accounts and perspectives be part of the wider narrative on any given conflict, which I really think with the language that we have traditionally used to talk about conflict has been understandably deeply male and deeply focused on the military realm. And so I very much hope, without making sort of broad generalizations about gender, but because I'm a woman, because I can spend time with women, because I understand the way a lot of these women think and operate and perceive their experience, and I have the rare privilege of being able to share that with a wider audience, I genuinely hope that expands and broadens and gives more nuance to the whole language around war.
Before we turn to Ukraine, I want to ask you about Afghanistan. You were there during a critical period, most of August, I guess from the first week of August until almost the end. You witnessed the chaos, the drama, the sacrifice in those several weeks. You've had almost a year now to process that experience. What are your takeaways? Or I guess, the thing that impressed you, not negatively or positively, what has etched in your mind as a result of those weeks?
I mean, honestly, the sheer desperation of people, the profound anger, bitterness, sadness, a deep feeling of abandonment. This is from Afghan people who I was talking to and spending time with and watching, trying to desperately clamor into the airport any which way they possibly could. I think you couldn't look at those scenes, whether or not you thought that ending the war was the correct thing to do. It's almost not really the point. The point was the way in which the war ended, and what that said about the U.S. as a power, as a sort of global hegemon, and the sort of changing nature of U.S. power. And of course, you couldn't look at it without thinking of this, these bookends of 9/11. And 20 years later, this extraordinary moment. So I think it was one of those stories where you understand that what you're witnessing is really something that will go down in history. And I don't know yet exactly what historians will write about that moment. I'm very privileged to feel like I had something of a hand in the first draft. But in terms of drawing broader conclusions, I'm always reluctant to do that because I get so much anger directed at me, usually on Twitter, from people who see me when I give voice to what Afghans are feeling. They say, "Oh, you're so critical of the Biden administration. You're so this, you're so that," and it's not. I'm not anything. Okay, I'm a vessel. I'm a vessel, I'm a messenger. But people don't want to hear the message, right? And I feel it's fundamentally important for us all to hear the message, and particularly the message of Afghanistan. And there were multiple messages, by the way. It wasn't just the message of people being abandoned. It was also the message of people who supported the Taliban, and women even living in areas that supported the Taliban, who were saying, what the hell was this 20-year war all about? What was the point? What did you achieve? So there's a lot of messages that you're delivering as a journalist, and often is very uncomfortable for people at home to hear them, which is why I'm always very cautious about drawing conclusions.
Sure. One U.S. senator who will remain nameless was an example of that partisanship. And we live in a partisan world, and I just wonder whether or not, and I think I know the answer to this, whether or not you think, despite the polarization, the tribalization of politics in the United States, whether or not there still is space, greater need perhaps, for the kind of reporting that you do, which does convey, with honesty and clarity and integrity, voices. And even though those voices may be saying things that Americans do not want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very, very strongly about it. I feel like that's why I started doing this. It wasn't all about trying to understand a part of the world that clearly wasn't very deeply understood in terms of the events leading up to 9/11. It was also about trying to help Americans understand that the way America sees its role in the world and itself is not necessarily the way other people see America. And I know that can be a very bitter pill to swallow, because I had to swallow it too when I was starting out doing this work, and it's hurtful and it's uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, the job of a journalist is not to pick and choose which narratives that you present to people. The job of a journalist is to give a voice to people who are on the ground in these various places and allow them the opportunity, because they don't get that opportunity to stand in the House or the Senate and say their piece. So this is the chance they get, is to be, on CNN, for example, and to give an accounting of their experience of American foreign policy, or their experience of any given situation. It doesn't always pertain directly to U.S. foreign policy.
All right. Let's turn to Ukraine. Every conflict is different. There's no question about it. I mean, grouping them all together, some things do in fact bind them. But in your view, how is Ukraine reporting in Ukraine different from the other environments in which you've worked?
So, I mean, how is it different? It's different. I mean, first of all, Ukraine is vast, right? I mean, geographically, it's a huge country, which I think people don't necessarily have a good sense of. And it's also very difficult to report from, let's say I'm in the capital, Kiev, with all these different events happening in different places around the country. Some of them we have reporters, many of them we don't. Some of them don't have telephones and internet connections anymore because obviously that's, in the case of Mariupol, for example, in the southeast, is one of the first things the Russians try to do is cut off communications. So that's a real challenge. I can't say that's unique to Ukraine, but I definitely felt the full pressure of that, covering this huge moment in real time. And I think also, look, you can't discount the fact that this is the largest ground invasion in Europe since World War II. 4 million people have been made refugees in just over a month. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's a historic moment. And so you do feel this huge amount of pressure to make sure you're doing justice to the story, while also then going about all the other things you're trying to do in that situation. Make sure you have food in case you get besieged. Make sure you have water. Make sure you have backup telecommunications. Make sure that you're keeping your team safe. Make sure that you have vehicles that can still get in and out. Make sure that your local staff are safe. And so it's a huge amount of pressure on, what is probably the biggest story I've covered since arguably. Yeah, I mean, actually now I'm impressing myself. I can't think of a bigger story that I've covered.
So take us through, I know your day is 9 a.m. to 4 a.m. I think you had given an interview, and I think you'd mentioned that. So take us through take us through a day in the life.
So a day in the life is, so I'll start from we'll finish doing Anderson's show at 4 a.m. local, go to bed. And you can't really make any, you're too tired at that point to make any plans. So get up at 9 a.m. It'll probably be lying in bed, but doing WhatsApp chats with the team, just going over, okay, what's our target today? What do we think we want to go see or do? What was the news overnight? What are the most pressing stories? Then it will really take you at least usually a couple of hours to cobble together a plan, do a risk assessment, talk to your security guys, talk to your local producers who need to make phone calls to set things up. And then you might go out at about 11 or 12, stay out for 3 or 4 hours, come back, try to write, screen the material, write the story, edit the story, and then you do lives around it until 4 a.m. And before you know it, it's all over again. So it's a pretty intense day. You can't go out every day. It's just not really possible in terms of energy levels, especially with that amount of live shots. But we certainly were going out every other day and sometimes every day. And it's a huge amount of work, but you really felt like it was absolutely, you wanted to be doing it, and there's nowhere else you'd rather be.
Who does your risk analysis on a day-to-day basis? Do you rely on Ukrainian? I mean, the unsung heroes here, I'm assuming, are the Ukrainian nationals.
Sure. I mean, it's a collaboration. So we had in country with us, CNN, we have our own security consultants, one of whom, Mike Pratt, I work very closely with, and my team works very closely with. He's super experienced. And he would sit down with our local producer, Dennis, and with my producer, Brent, and they basically will spend, it's like doing a Rubik's Cube, right? Or cracking a safe. It's like you sit there and you're like, how can we do this? Can we do that? No, too dangerous. Can we do this? Maybe. Could we go with local aid workers? Let's try to call them. Could we go with, and so on and so forth. And it's frustrating because it's slow going, and it's really hard sometimes to find the code that cracks the safe, so to speak, and makes it possible to do some of this reporting. But there isn't really any other way. You just have to keep pushing on and making phone calls and scratching your head and guessing another scenario that might possibly work.
You referred earlier to the fact that war now is covered through social media, both positively and negatively, I suspect. How has that factor influenced the way you do business?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I think it's very positive in the sense that you just have much greater diversity of voices telling stories, and particularly people on the ground whose country it is telling stories. So we look at the, enormous amount, not just of Ukrainian journalists, but, politicians, cultural figures, ordinary people who can get on Twitter or Telegram or Facebook and start contributing to the conversation. So for me, that's a plus, right? Because it means there's just more vibrancy, more nuance, and a greater diversity of storytellers out there. It does also make it challenging because then, as you know, at CNN, obviously our job is to try to independently verify a lot of these claims, and you can't take anything at face value, no matter where you are. You have to sort of double source and get confirmation from authorities, and it's a lot of hard work. We have come to rely hugely on an extraordinarily talented group of journalists based in our London bureau and our New York bureau: Gianluca Mezzafiore, Katie Polglaze, Paul Murphy, who are part of what we call like the sort of, well, they're an investigative group, but their main work that they do are geolocating videos.
Right.
So you'll see these videos that will come up online, and it says this is a video of the theater in Mariupol that has been bombed. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, I've seen the theater once. It kind of looks like it, but it's been bombed. So what do I, how can I tell? And that's a scenario where it might be easier to guess. Sometimes it'll be like, this is on a highway outside Mykolaiv. And so what they're able to do using sort of open source state-of-the-art technology is to find out where these videos actually are and when they were made. And that gives us a much stronger degree of confidence in any given video or piece of information or a photograph, and allows us to really make sure that our reporting is spot on.
Tracking weather, for example, you receive an image that the Russians have attacked City X.
Mm-hmm.
Is it right or wrong? And that London unit actually can identify weather patterns to make sure on that day, plus the actual location of where those things are taking place, to decide whether it was photoshopped or.
Oh no, it's extraordinary what they can do. And I remember an exact example. The Russian Ministry of Defense released some video that it said were like tanks, I believe, or sort of armored weaponry on its way into Kiev, but the video had snow in it, which, again, someone like me, a layman, I'm just going to watch it and be like, wow, that's pretty crazy. Is that possible? But our team in London were immediately like, no, there's snow. It hasn't snowed since X, Y, or Z date. Therefore, this is old video, or it's, just a fake. So again, it's like, it's a totally different mindset, and I am in constant awe of it, and am absolutely humbled by it, because I do not possess that sort of that particular synapse that enables people to be really good at that kind of work. But it's a crucial part of the journalism that we do today. Again, like Maxar. Who had heard of Maxar before? These satellite images that have become an integral part of how we understand what's happening on the ground with Ukraine, and particularly in the run-up, seeing all these different Russian ground forces massing on the border. So the way we cover conflict and the information that we have at our fingertips is changing all the time, primarily in ways that are, a little bit daunting for, fuddy-duddies like me, but are basically really, really exciting.
Before we close, I have two more questions for you. One is analytical. I know you've been out of Ukraine now for some time, but there's a difference between secrets on one hand and mysteries on the other. Secrets are things that are countable or uncountable. They can be known, they're simply hidden. Mysteries are more inexplicable, things that may not be readily knowable. I know you were on Colbert a while back, and he drew you into a discussion of Vladimir Putin, and Putin's motives. Thinking this through now with the benefit of time and space away from Ukraine, do you have any thoughts on the mystery, which remains a mystery, of what Vladimir Putin is thinking?
Yeah.
Why Ukraine and why now?
Yeah. I did think it was a mystery before, and now I think it was just a miscalculation, honestly. I genuinely believe that Putin was told by all of those around him that this was going to be a cakewalk, that they were going to go in, and within a matter of days, they were going to basically annex Ukraine and implement their will and establish a pro-Kremlin government, and that people would come out into the streets and, cheer them on. And I think that's always the danger when you live in an echo chamber, right? And you only needed to look at the sort of absurd stage theatrics of these meetings with him and his National Security Council, where he's sitting at this enormous table like 5 miles away from the rest of them, and they're being chastised like naughty schoolboys, to realize that nobody is telling him the truth. Or certainly it would appear that way. So I actually feel now that it's less of a mystery and more of an obvious miscalculation. Yeah.
Let me close by just recounting what David Rhodes, a former president of CBS, said about you. He said, quote, "There are single-digit numbers of people globally who are really good at this." And this, he meant, what it is that a journalist and a war correspondent actually does. And she's one of them. You're one of them. And I could say, Clarissa Ward, that empathy is extremely important in this business. Not sympathy necessarily, but empathy. The capacity to put yourself in the shoes of another or the other, and convey with a sense of honesty and integrity what people are feeling and what they're doing. And you've managed to do that in a remarkable way. And I want to thank you for spending your precious time with us here today. And thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. Carnegie Next will be hosting Marie Jovanovic next week, April 6th, our former ambassador to Ukraine, in what I think will be a fascinating conversation about her memoir and her views of the current situation. So until then, think positive and test negative. Take care, Clarissa.